Live here with SCI TV. I'm Joshua Gordon. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Ken Pendleton, and our special guest, Jason Belzer. Welcome, gentlemen.
Welcome, Josh. Or glad to be here, Josh.
Great. So, Jason, you're new to our audience. So, what we're hoping is you give a little background. You have a very interesting bio that covers everything from teaching to writing to consulting. So, maybe you could touch on a few of those areas as part of your introduction.
Sure. So I am a sports and entertainment attorney, Rutgers graduate, both undergrad and law school. Started my sports agency, Game Inc. Global Athlete Management Enterprises, about 7 years ago, and I focus on the representation of coaches, both college and professional. So I work with about 30 college basketball and football coaches, as well as some professional basketball coaches. And we do everything from contract negotiation to marketing, PR, shoe deals, the whole 9 yards. We also have an event management division where I help run various college sporting events, including the College Insider Postseason Tournament, the CIT, which is a 32-team men's basketball tournament for Division I basketball teams that can't make the NCAA or NIT tournament. We started that 6 years ago, and last year we became the second largest privately run college sporting event in the country behind the Rose Bowl. We had over 90,000 people in attendance. I do consulting with universities through Collegiate Sports Advisors, CSA. We work with universities to help their student athletes transition from amateur to professional careers. So selecting an agent, working with financial planners, going through the draft, figuring out whether or not they should even declare for the draft, and all of that. And then I started teaching for my alma mater, Rutgers, about 3 years ago. I teach organizational behavior in sports, as well as sports law and risk management. And most recently, about 2 years ago, I started writing for Forbes magazine. And I cover all kinds of sports business issues, but most prominently talk about organizational behavior issues in college and professional sports.
A great background, Jason. Thank you for joining us today. But part of what I'd be interested in hearing is, how did you come up with a focus on coaches? You hear so many folks when they're going into representation really locking in on athletes, and it's a pretty interesting perspective. Can you give us a little background on how you arrived at where you did?
Sure. So when I was in college, I knew that I wanted to work in college sports in some capacity. I didn't really want to be an athletic director, or maybe better said, I didn't really know what an athletic director did. But I was kind of enamored, just like a lot of people in my generation, with Jerry Maguire and Arliss and Entourage and all these shows and movies that you see on TV. And I said, well, maybe I can be an agent and work with coaches. And I took a double route, started working with coaches and players. And I quickly realized that representing players was much more akin to babysitting than actually being a manager. You know, when you're working with a 20 or 21-year-old kid that doesn't have much life experience, it's very different than working with a 40-year-old man with 2 kids and a mortgage that wants sound business advice. And it's a little bit less cutthroat. It doesn't mean that it's not competitive, but most of the stories that you've heard about the sports agency business are true. And it doesn't change a lot on the coaching level, but at least I know I can have a frank, honest conversation most of the time with someone mature versus dealing in a business that is all about what have you done for me lately.
With all the litigation that's being directed at the NCAA lately, most notably the O'Bannon trial, a lot of attention is being given to the amount of money coaches are making, right? And so one of the arguments the NCAA tried to make was they were going to harm the non-revenue generating sports if they were forced to to recognize players' images, likeness rights, etc. But the judge seemed to actually point out that there were other people, including coaches, who were making a lot of money. And I'm wondering if that is a strain that actually comes up in the negotiations these days, or how some of the people you represent feel about the fact that they make, say someone like Nick Saban may make millions of dollars. He himself could fund lots of non-revenue generating sports, and whether that's an issue that they think about.
So, obviously we live in a capitalist society. So it's certainly and it's a free market, and that's why the coaches' salaries have been driven to the millions and millions of dollars that they are today. But most coaches realize that the universities that they work for wouldn't necessarily be able to pay for them if they couldn't afford it, right? So if someone couldn't afford to pay $7 million to Nick Saban, then Alabama wouldn't pay him that money. And the reality is that someone like Nick Saban, who's the highest paid college coach for any sport, while he makes $7 million a year, the University of Alabama's football program also generates $44 million a year. So there are very few coaches that are paid in the 6 to 7 figures that don't make that money back for their schools hand and fist. And that money is then used to fund all the other non-revenue producing sports. And again, if it was all about the money, then there would be only 2 sports that exist in college. That would be football and men's basketball, because no other sport makes money. Women's basketball doesn't make money. Baseball doesn't make money. Nothing makes money other than football and men's basketball.
Jason, when you're working with your coaches, how involved do you get in helping them deal with some of the challenges they face in their jobs, whether it's difficult athletic directors or challenging athletes? How much do you get involved in helping them create systems and structures that create success in the role that they're doing?
So it's interesting. I mean, when I just started in the business, I really only focused on the marketing and management aspect, doing the contracts. But then as I became a student and later a professor of organizational behavior, really started working with my coaches on their day-to-day. And honestly, I try not to get too involved unless they ask. I respect the way that they do things, and I try to learn from them more than I try to teach. But you do learn a couple of things, and I've had many situations where a coach has come to me and said that he's having issues with one of his players or some sort of team dynamic that he doesn't know what to do about, and how I would suggest that he will go about doing that. And I really look at the different programs that I've studied and the different things that happen and figure out how they can apply to those types of situations to help them out, him or her out, since I represent women's coaches as well.
What makes the organizational psychology of sports, do you think, different than other fields, in the entertainment field and business more generally?
It's different, but it's very much the same too. First and foremost, it's a much higher pressure environment, I think. The reality is that if you're having organizational issues at Goldman Sachs or some other Forbes 400 company or whoever it may be, the media is not necessarily breathing down your neck like they are if your football team is losing too many games. So that puts a huge strain on it. I think it's also important to remember that coaches and CEOs of major companies have inherently very different training. If you go and become the CEO of a major company, chances are that you have a pretty robust education. You're an attorney, you have your MBA, you've been trained in dealing with these types of organizational issues. Coaches may not necessarily have that type of training, and so they are in charge of multi-million-dollar organizations, so to speak. Again, use the University of Alabama. It's a $30 million corporation, and they don't necessarily have the experience to deal with those types of organizational issues. And so it has to be approached very differently. And the reality is that in an organization like a football team, you have 80 players or 90 players. If one of those players isn't doing their job, the entire team can't function. It can't succeed. It can't win games. If you have one person not doing their job in a major corporation, chances are you're going to be okay unless that person is somehow incredibly important or at the very, very top of the organization. So it's almost a bottom-up type of organizational function versus a top-down, which you see more in the corporate world.
So, Jason, one of the things that we've heard a lot from athletic directors is that mostly they empower their coaches to, succeed or fail based on their own sense of organizational culture and how they go there. They might set the tone with some mission statements or some other more aspirational parts of the organization, but they tend not to be particularly hands-on or prescriptive of exactly how the coach should run that sub-part of the organization, which to me highlights how important some of the work you're doing around organizational support and development with coaches. What are some of the ways in which you're able to interface with coaches and give them some of that expertise? Because, like you said, they don't have that educational background most often where they've been through an MBA or something where they're talking about these kind of things. So how do they get some of that acumen to be particularly effective as CEOs of these organizations, really?
It's a great question. A lot of them are proactive in trying to learn about these things. And you would be surprised how many very successful coaches you'll talk to that have read Peter Drucker or Jim Collins, and they try to learn because they understand that there's a lot of commonality in that. And even the articles that I've written for Forbes magazine exist because I wanted to make sure that coaches knew that this type of information was out there and to be able to have those types of comparisons and learn from those types of lessons. But the reality is, and I speak very frankly about this, when I meet a coach and I have a conversation with them, I can very quickly tell whether or not they're going to be successful in what they do. And the first thing that I look for is whether or not they're open-minded and are willing to understand that while they may be very good when it comes to things like recruiting or X's and O's, if they're not willing to listen to the people that are on their staff, if they're only going to hire people that are willing to tell them yes, yes, yes instead of maybe no, then you know that someone's going to be successful or not. And the reality is that you see those in business settings as well. I mean, if you're only hiring yes people, as Jim Collins calls it, the genius with 1,000 helpers, you're unlikely to succeed. And I can tell you that almost every coach that has failed is because he surrounds himself with people that are not willing to raise their voice and to provide input. And going back to your thoughts about the athletic directors, if I see that an athletic director wants to have too much control over a program when he's hiring a coach, I immediately recommend to my client that this is not the right opportunity. Because, again, what does an AD know about necessarily running a team? If he wasn't a coach in his previous life, well, he's an administrator. I mean, he may have a corporate background. He knows how to fundraise. He doesn't know the first thing about team dynamics, about running a efficient moving machine with 85 20-year-old players that need to work in a certain way. And I always tell my clients as well, when they're looking at a job, you may be qualified for a position, but fit doesn't necessarily come naturally. And that is the biggest issue in college sports today. Unlike any other industry, in college basketball and football and in the professional sports, there is almost a 20% turnover every year of head coaches. Imagine if you took any industry and said that at any given year, up to 20% of all of the CEOs in that industry would be fired. You can imagine the type of turmoil and organizational dysfunction that you could have from that. And that's why a lot of schools continue to have very mediocre programs or programs that don't have any success because they constantly hire and then fire and then hire and then fire. I mean, my own alma mater, Rutgers University, is a perfect example of that. We haven't been to the NCAA tournament since 1991, so about 25 years. We've fired every single coach that we've had on the basketball side since 1984, which is why we can't win. Because you hire somebody, and then a couple of years later, once they've kind of learned what to do and have built a system, they get fired because they haven't had enough time to win enough games or for whatever reason it may be. And we make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And it's incredibly frustrating being someone on the sidelines of a program, particularly my university, my employer. But those are the mistakes that you see. Whereas you take Butler, for example, which has been extraordinarily successful for the last 60 years. Why? Because they only hire from within. They only hire people that understand the culture of the program, that are fits, that understand the core values that they follow, that have been around the program, that have played for the program, and they're successful. Boise State, same thing. They've done it year after year after year on budgets much smaller than other programs, and they're successful because they understand the importance of fit over being qualified necessarily.
I mean, to take a really dramatic example, someone like John Wooden might not have survived at UCLA if he had gone as long as he did without making it to the Final Four, right? That there's been this there's definitely a lot more pressure to succeed and succeed quickly. So you used to see the coach at Notre Dame, even Jerry Faust, got a 5-year contract, and he couldn't complain when he was eased out the door in '85. But Tyrone Willingham only got a few years by comparison. So are athletic directors receptive when you bring this up and actually say you guys need to be a little more you need to really stick to an idea like I need a 5-year plan. I always think Bear Bryant said there's 2 things you need to be a good coach: an understanding life and a 5-year contract. And I'm wondering what do they say to you when you say that to them? Do they see the long-term value?
I would say that it's mixed. I would say that most don't. There are some very, very good athletic directors out there that have built very successful programs and understand the value of giving a coach time to build. A lot of them look for quick solutions. You know, put a Band-Aid on something that needs stitches or needs a lot more than that. And it's tough. I mean, you have these conversations. The issue that we have to think about here is that, and it's reality, and I think that every athletic director, as much as they don't want to discuss it, will admit there's not a lot of accountability from an administrator side. The reality is that an AD hires a coach. He may give him a couple of years. If it doesn't work out, then he fires him and he hires another coach. And then that coach doesn't work out, well, then he fires that coach. When does the AD get fired? Isn't the AD's responsibility to hire competent individuals? And you can take a look at a lot of different programs. I won't name names, but there are ADs that have been had their job for a decade, 2 decades, and they've hired every single coach that they've hired. So when is that AD going to lose his job for not hiring the right person? If you're a CEO of a major company and you hire someone that's incompetent, okay, maybe you'll get away with it once. You do that 2, 3, 4 times, how quickly is the board going to remove you when you do that? So until there's more accountability from the athletic director side, there's not going to be much care on whether or not they should keep a coach around for a couple of more years because they want a quick solution. They want something sexy. They want to win the press conference, as they say, and it takes time and understanding to do that. You know, a great example of the opposite is University of North Carolina. And I say that because you look at everything that they've done from a coaching standpoint, hiring coaches, retaining people, whether it's Dean Smith or Roy Williams now. Bubby Cunningham, who's the new AD at University of North Carolina, is probably one of the best ADs out there. And he really understands what it takes to build an athletic program with integrity. And he inherited a tumultuous situation there right now with their academic fraud situation. But he's helping overcome that. And one of his proteges, or a protege of their former AD as well, Carlton Creech, recently became the University of Maine's athletic director. And he hired one of my clients, Bob Walsh, who was a Division III coach at Rhode Island College. And Bob is one of the only Division III coaches in the last decade to get a Division I job. He spent 9 years building a program with no scholarships and turned them into a Division III powerhouse. And Carlton looked at the situation that he had at the University of Maine. They've never been to the NCAA tournament. They have non-existent resources. And he said, I have to find somebody that's had this type of situation before. That's not only the qualifications are there, but what's the fit? And I can tell you that there are a million ADs out there who would have been in Carlton's position, who had come from a major school like North Carolina or UCLA or Texas or whatever it may be, who'd have went and hired the sexiest name they could get, the biggest associate head coach at a nice program, and said, this guy is going to turn around our problems and we're going to be successful. And that coach would have fell flat on his face because they didn't have the experience, and the AD didn't have the willingness and the accountability to actually have to hire someone that was competent for the job. And so that's what you see. When you see someone willing to go outside the box and actually hire someone that's qualified, it works. I don't think I've ever represented a client that was a better fit for a job than Bob is for the University of Maine. And there are clients out there that I've fortunately never been terminated or fired by any of my clients, but I've had situations in the past where I've decided to not work with clients because they have not listened to my advice and taken over programs that I didn't think that they would be a fit for, that they wouldn't be successful for because of the conflict that they would potentially have with their athletic directors. And 2-3 years later, they're looking for another job, and they call me again, and I say, listen, you didn't listen to me the first time. Why am I going to work with you now?
Hey, Jason, you mentioned fit a few times in terms of that search and trying to make a good match between program, athletic director, and some of your coaches. Can you dig a little deeper into what are some of those considerations on fit beyond culture? What are the other things that go into making sure that that is a good fit and has that durability that we've been talking about being so important?
Sure. So it depends what the program is, but there are dynamics like fundraising, for example. So most coaches are required to do some sort of fundraising. Now, if you're at say a major football school, let's say like Alabama, Nick Saban is doing the primary fundraising at that program. And someone like Anthony Grant, who's their men's basketball coach, great coach, probably is not responsible for doing the same amount of fundraising because, well, basketball is not really big at the University of Alabama. You say, look at the same thing at Auburn, for example. Now, if you're at a smaller school, let's say a University of Maine or a Butler, that doesn't have a football program, well, then all of a sudden, that coach is now responsible for juggling two things. He's responsible for actually coaching his program and being successful, and he's also responsible for raising money. I mean, I represent a football coach in Tennessee, Division I, who in his contract, when we renegotiated the deal, had an escalator, and it specifically said that he needed to hit over a certain amount of money in fundraising. And I said, this is ridiculous. Why would a coach have to be responsible contractually to raise money? It's not his job to coach your football team, to win games, to recruit players, to make sure that they're graduating on time. Now you're going to tell me that he needs to raise $100,000 or $200,000 or $300,000 a year in money? When is he going to have time for that? And so that's part of fit, whether or not you're even capable of raising money, whether or not you can balance the time and necessity of doing that, whether or not you're required to schmooze with alumni and boosters, whether or not you know how to recruit in a certain area. There's only certain types of kids that will go to certain types of places, and you have to be able to have those relationships. If you spend your entire career in Southern California, I don't think you're going to want to be the next head men's basketball coach at UConn, because you don't really have the relationships there. And yes, maybe you've recruited players nationally, but it's much more difficult. You're putting a severe penalty on yourself to become successful at those types of programs.
Well, this raises another issue, which is, with all the things you're mentioning, and now you add to this the idea that an elite coach has these huge fundraising responsibilities. It makes me think of Urban Meyer and what happened at the University of Florida, where he burnt out. And do you think, in the wake of that, do you think coaches have really made a conscious effort to think about how, what is a reasonable amount of time to spend on the job period, and how to use that time in a way where they don't risk what happening to Meyer?
I think they do, and I think, again, it comes back to the successful coaches delegating properly. I mean, if a head coach is smart at what he does, and I have clients that they just show up for practice, or sometimes they don't even necessarily go to all of their practices. They have their assistants run. They look at what the most important thing they can do is, and they do that. And it comes back to controlling your controllables, right? If you're a micromanager and you're going to want to get involved in everything, then you're going to burn out. It's going to happen. I mean, look at a guy like Skip Prosser, who died a couple of years ago at Wake Forest. I knew Skip. He was one of the hardest working people you meet in the business, and you can ask anyone, and they would have told you, if you were going to name a coach that might have died of stress, Skip might have been that guy. And it was because of the way that he went around doing things. And I think that Urban saw that. I think that Urban thought about that and said, well, there's just too much pressure on me. There's too much pressure on my family. I need to take a break. And I know for a fact that when he went to Ohio State, it wasn't, well, Florida part 2. I'm going to go work and I'm going to be in the office 120 hours a week and that's it. He had a long conversation with the athletic director there, and he made sure that he had the resources necessary that he could take the time to spend with his family and to not be going a mile a minute. And some of these coaches, they do that and they burn out and they're not successful. And I can tell you, I know enough coaches that have been extremely successful that you don't have to do that. You don't have to be in the office 100 hours a week as a coach. You need to be able to delegate. You need to be able to know what's important and what's not, and you need to have the support of your administration and the people around you, and you can become successful.
And Jason, we're always looking for examples of which programs are really exemplary in the work that they do. And in your writing, you've had a chance to examine a number of programs and seek exactly that, which organizations are doing things innovatively, best practices are out there. What would be a couple of those that you would highlight that you've come in contact with that serve as that best practice that people should look towards, and how to prevent conflict and how to manage an organization in a really efficient way that sets you up for winning on and off the field?
Sure. So I think probably the best case study in this situation is, in fact, not a team or a school, but it's a conference. It's the Southeastern Conference, the SEC. Everyone knows the SEC is the most dominant football conference and really the de facto conference in college sports. But what Mike Slive has done there as commissioner is something really, really amazing. He is, without question, one of the top leaders in all of sports and maybe really in all of organizations around the world. And he's done some really amazing things to create that incredibly powerful conference, but there's so much conflict involved in that too. I mean, he mentions the rivalries that you see in the SEC conference, like between Auburn and Alabama. These people absolutely hate each other. I mean, they want nothing to do with each other. And you sit there and you say, you know, Mike told me, how do I convince the athletic director from Alabama to do the same thing as the athletic director from Auburn and LSU and Texas A&M, get them all on the same page when all they want to do is beat the living out of each other? And that's not easy. It's so difficult to do that. And how do you control this organization? I mean, each school has a $100 million budget. You put it all collectively, I mean, their budget is not too far off from a major professional sports organization like the NBA. I mean, over $1 billion from all the different schools and their revenues. And, you know, Mike has done that through, one, tipping point leadership. He's been able to unite the individuals in his conference. And if any of you are familiar with the concept of blue ocean strategy and the 3 E principles of fair process, that's something that Mike follows. In fact, Mike didn't really realize that he followed them, but after speaking with him, I was able to identify them fairly quickly. There's 3 aspects: engagement, expectation clarity, and explanation. And the first element of that is engagement. He brings together all of the coaches from all the different teams every year to have a frank conversation about what needs to be improved in the conference. And then after he has that conversation, then he brings in the athletic directors, then he brings in the team president or the school presidents, and he has conversations with them. And he gives everyone essentially fair vote. And so everyone has the opportunity to be engaged. Everyone has an opinion. Nick Saban has just as much of a vote as the men's tennis coach at Mississippi State. And because of that, people are humble. They realize that they are not above anybody, even though they may be responsible for a much larger proportion of the revenue that's coming into their school or their conference. And that's really something that's special. You have explanation. And from that perspective, when they decided to expand the conference to take in Missouri and Texas A&M, they did not just say, well, we need to go and expand because the Big Ten is taking other teams. They said we need to be systematic about this process. We need to sit down and determine what are the best programs that fit our conference, whether or not we should even take any of those programs. Is there a reason for what we're doing? And what is that going to do to our culture? Because we have a certain way of doing that. And are those teams going to adopt that culture? Are they going to make us better for it, or are we just making a reactionary defensive move? And the last component is expectation clarity. And I love Mike for doing this. Anytime a new coach comes in, particularly on the football side of things, he sits them down and he has a conversation and he explains what the conference expects of that person. And he says that we will be here to support you, but if you cheat, I hope you get fired. He literally says that. He says, if you cheat, I will be the one that is responsible for ending your career. He makes it absolutely clear that they have a zero tolerance policy for these things, and for that reason, for the most part, the SEC has been pretty clear about what they've done. Now, one of my clients ended up doing something very wrong a couple of years ago, Bruce Pearl, who was at Tennessee and is now at Auburn, and they gave him a 5-year show cause penalty, which was the most severe penalty ever given to a coach for lying to the NCAA. And part of that was because of the conference's bequest, because they wanted to teach their coaches that that was unacceptable in what they were doing. And you got to think about the biggest names in sports, the biggest coaches that work in that conference, some big egos, and they all know their place because everything is laid out before them.
Well, it's interesting to think about. Just recently the SEC had their meeting, and they were being much more proactive in my mind than the other conferences about thinking about how can we compel better out-of-conference scheduling. So, for example, Florida has to play Florida State at the end, but Texas doesn't have to play Texas A&M. And it's not. And meanwhile, you have all this scheduling of weak opponents that that actually is it's hard to sell. Like University of Florida, which has always had sellouts, is struggling to sell season tickets in a way that they haven't before. And so I thought it was really great that they would try to take that on proactively. It makes me think, though, your school, Rutgers, is now joining the Big Ten. And I can't help but ask, how do you evaluate the move for Rutgers and the organizational structure of the Big Ten? How do you feel compares to the SEC?
So I like Jim Delaney. I think his leadership style is a little bit different than Mike Slive. I think Delaney is more out there. He's willing to be a little bit more aggressive. And when I wrote an article with him about decision making, which was one of my favorite pieces to write on in the last couple of years, and the decision making process that they went through to add Nebraska and then Maryland and Rutgers, Jim specifically requested that I didn't make it appear as though he was a pirate on the high seas, stealing away teams from different conferences. And I said, I will word it in the right way, Jim, but the reality is that that's what you did. You made an aggressive, a bold move. I refer to it as a bold maneuver, as in the words of Robert Greene, a bold maneuver to make an offensive action to put everyone else in a defensive posture. He saw what the SEC did. He saw that the ACC was making moves, and he knew that he had to do something important, and he knew he had to do something that was going to essentially shock people. And by adding Maryland and taking them out of the ACC, they were a charter member of the ACC conference. By taking Rutgers, he basically stopped realignment. And so the Big Ten is very smart. I mean, they created the Big Ten Network. They were the first major network for a conference. Their tradition is unbelievable. I mean, it's on par with the SEC conference. They're developing some amazing properties. They're expanding to the east, obviously. They knew that the New York to Washington, D.C. corridor is the most heavily populated area in North America, and that's something that they had to own. Regarding Rutgers in particular, I don't know if we are going to be successful, at least from the outset. I mean, it's much better for us. It's a better fit culturally from an academic standpoint. We fit there as compared to the Big East. We're a great academic institution. But from an athletic standpoint, we still have a lot to go. We haven't really been successful for many of the reasons that I've mentioned before. There's not necessarily the type of support. I mean, our alumni base is pretty divided after everything that happened last year with the hiring or the firing of Tim Pernetti and the hiring of Julie Herman. I think it's going to take a couple of years for us to adjust. I think those years are not going to be very fun to watch as a fan. But I think we have potential if the right leadership does the right things and we get things done. But it comes down to accountability, which Rutgers has not had in a long time from an administrative standpoint and a coaching standpoint. And, I think, or at least I hope, that individuals like Jim Delaney, who now have a vested interest in the university, are going to try to exert some of their own influence to make sure that we're on the right track. And I don't think that the Big Ten wants another doormat, that's for sure.
And Jason, we have to ask, certainly, with everything going on with the NCAA, what are some of the changes we can expect, whether near term or long term, based on your analysis and the work you do? There's certainly a lot of legal action going on right now and movement for unionization and everything else. What are some of the things you're anticipating?
So it's a loaded question. It's a loaded topic, obviously. I don't think that we're going to see anytime soon college players being paid anything significant. The system just doesn't work. First of all, from a legal standpoint, it's extremely complicated. Secondly, most universities just can't afford to pay their players competitive salaries. I think we're going to see an increase in the stipend. I think we're going to see some liberties when it comes to players making money off the field, like for their likeness and image, autograph signings. There's going to, there might be a cap. They might say, listen, you can go sign autographs and make up to a couple of $1,000s a year, and that's income that you want to keep. That's fine. What I do think is that there will be a new division, a Division 4, if you want to call that. I think one of the main reasons that will be is not just because that some teams may start paying their players or giving them some sort of stipend. A lot of these schools, just through the landscape of college sports, in particular football, the Division 1 teams, like let's say an Ohio State or University of Florida, goes and pays a Georgia Southern or a smaller Division 1 AA school $1 million to come play in a guarantee game. these schools are now moving away from those guarantee games. And if I take $1 million that was coming to a university through a guarantee game out of their budget, that is a severe infringement and a curtailment really on their way to operate. And if they're not getting the money from those guarantee games, they're just not going to really be able to compete on that level. And so the more of that you see, the acceleration of the breakup of the NCAA in the sense of a different division is gonna happen. A lot of people say, will the NCAA go by the wayside? Will they even exist in a couple of years? I think they will. There's no reason why the Big Five conferences need to go start another group. Because what are they going to start? They're going to start the NCAA Part 2. They need 95% of the rules that are there. They just need to be a little bit more flexible on some of the financial issues.
Well, when I think about those, the big schools, one of the things that would occur to me is why not have them mandate that they only play each other? No, even though Georgia Southern proved that you're playing Florida, they could give Florida more than a good game. Nonetheless, it seems to me if the big schools could only play each other, they would generate so much more money from season ticket sales and television revenue that they could afford to distribute some of that back down to the Georgia Southerns or the Wyomings. The fans there'd be better TV, better in-game attendance, and it would be actually good for the integrity of the sports, because for every 25 times the Georgia every one time Georgia Southern beats Florida, there are 24 times that it's a blowout the other way. And
right.
So, do you think the NCAA would be open to, or this new league, this new division you're thinking would be open to that kind of sort of far-reaching thinking that I think Mike Slive, for example, would be on top of?
Well, let me ask you a question. How is the economic system of college sports different than professional sports in the United States? So that's the answer to your question.
Yeah. Well, I think in the relevant ways of that question, I don't think it is. I mean, they have certain tax advantages, right? that are.
I mean, if you want to look at it from a very simple perspective, professional sports in the United States is a socialistic system, right? You have salary caps. You have essentially collusion to do certain things, to draft players in a certain way. And ask any professional sports team owner, most of them are very wealthy individuals, and they'll admit that. College sports is very different. It's a capitalistic system, right? So why would, say, Ohio State or Texas want to go play somebody else and then take that revenue distribution and give it back to the smaller schools?
Because I mean, they would make more money. And because instead of like look at what's happening with Florida, and I know part of it is the losing under Muschamp in through 2 of his 3 years. But if all of a sudden they're out of conference games in addition to Florida State, involved playing even good teams from, let's say they were playing Rutgers, let's say they were playing Michigan State and one of their other ones, they would sell 10,000 additional tickets, and that would pay for itself. So if they redistributed a fraction of that additional money down, the bottom line would be better.
Why do I agree? I agree that they would make much more money, and I'm a total advocate of that. But why would I still have to redistribute to somebody? What purpose do I have to support somebody else's athletic system? I can operate independently in my own division, taking my own money. I can maybe even start my own club. We'll call it the FCAA or whatever it may be. And I'm going to take 60 schools. We're going to play each other, and no one else gets anything. And that's the reality of the system. It was attempted to be run as a socialistic system where the revenue gets distributed, just like the NCAA tournament is now, right? Revenue distributions and everything else like that. And now people are beginning to realize, well, I'm spending $170 million on athletics every year. Why am I giving my money back to somebody, to UC Santa Barbara or to, Oregon Tech or whoever it may be? Why am I even involved in something like that? It doesn't make any sense, and that's why the system is falling apart.
Right. Your point's very well taken, and I agree. Because I was sort of presupposing a sort of a sense of egalitarianism, or looking at the best interest of a Wyoming or a Santa Barbara that you probably weren't. It occurs to me actually though that the biggest opposition to this, considering how much more profitable would actually be the coaches, because all of a sudden instead of having hard conference games and maybe one hard out of conference game, they would be facing 3 more difficult games a season, and that would obviously affect the bottom line, bowl eligibility, etc.
I agree with you, but by the same token, I think that coaches get fired either way. I mean, look at a guy like Gene Chizik, right, who won a national championship 3 years ago at Auburn, and then 2 years later didn't have a winning season. He played some cupcakes too, and he got fired. You win a national championship, and then 2 years you get fired for a losing record. I think, again, there are so many other variables, like I said, of no accountability and irrational decision making, that these guys are getting fired. I agree. Most coaches want a couple of cupcakes to play, but the NFL deals with it every year, right? There's parity in the league. They play each other on any given Sunday. Someone can win. If that was the standard, then that's the standard that everyone's going to be judged by. And, the average is always going to be 500. That's what it works out to be. So people are going to deal with it. They would have to compete against what they would have to compete. And their salaries are going to go up 4 too. I mean, there's more money, and there's more argument for people like me to ask for another $1 million for one of my clients.
Yeah, part of what I hear in the debate actually raised the issue of a larger systemic issue, which is that we have really some institutions that are purely still at their amateur roots, and others that have morphed more into a state of professionalism in college sports. And so if you have an organization that really just wants to provide as many athletic opportunities and student athletes out there, and certainly the non-revenue bearing sports mostly fall in this category anyways, and then you mix that into the same pot with those who are revenue producing or much more professional in nature from a facility standpoint and everything else, you get this very strange challenge of how should you do it, right? And so what I was hearing in both of your arguments was, well, if it were a true amateur system, one set of assumptions and circumstances would make sense, and if it were truly a professional system, that would make sense. And we don't really have a clean system one way or the other at this point.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, I always use the model of the Ivy League. I work very closely with a lot of the Ivy League schools, with the conference. I represent a lot of their coaches. They're non-scholarship. Each individual school supports more sports than any other institutions throughout the country. And they're not about the TV dollars. They're just not interested. I mean, it's about providing a robust student-athlete experience. And there's plenty of schools that can do that. Now, a lot of schools will argue, like let's say Butler, that by participating in Division I sports and making it to the Final Four 2 years in a row, that provided $50 million in media and marketing value. Well, great, but do you really need kids from California applying to your school because they saw you playing college basketball? I mean, look at 95% of your student population is from Indianapolis or in Indiana and 100 miles away. So, what's the real purpose of that, right? If you really just focus on what you're doing, you're going to get the same kids. They talk about how much marketing, or that college sports is the greatest marketing vehicle possible for a university. I agree. But you can only have a certain amount of kids and a certain amount of expectation. Is it really changing that much? An interesting research project is to figure out whether or not, after a team has had considerable success in sports, whether or not they've seen a sustained uptick in the quality of the students that have actually applied to that university. You hear, I know Butler mentions that they've had an additional 10,000 people every year now applying as compared to a decade ago. Okay, but is the quality of your student or alumni getting better because of that? Or is it basically the same? And I would venture to guess that it's probably the same. Because, again, most of the type of students that you're serving are local kids or in-state kids that have been around the program, whose parents have gone there, who whatever it may be. And you're just providing entertainment for your alumni and your fans. But why does it have to come at the cost of millions of dollars to stay competitive when that money could be going to research and academics, which is the actual purpose of your university?
Well, to me, it raises another issue. As you mentioned before, not only is every game a zero-sum game, there has to be a winner and a loser, but in a lot of ways, sports is a negative-sum game because there's one champion and a lot of teams that are runners-up or worse. As I think George Steinbrenner said, only the lead dog gets to breathe fresh air. And so I wonder if you think that's ever adequately been theorized into the way in which they structure the NCAA and the relationships between the larger divisions and the smaller divisions. Because I feel like, if I think of Butler and I go, well, that's great for Butler, but what happens to teams that have to compete with them? Central Michigan, Ball State, Miami of Ohio. Are they benefiting from Butler doing well in any meaningful way?
No, it's just another arms race. Most people don't realize that Butler was successful. I mean, Brad Stevens, Matthew Graves, their entire staff, Barry Collier, genius guys, amazing coaches, amazing administrators. Butler had the highest or largest budget for any program that would be classified as a mid-major in college basketball during the years of their run. And people turn around, and I cannot tell you how many ADs I've worked with and spoken to you about clients that said, I want to be the next Butler. I mean, Google, in quotation marks, we want to be the next Butler. Look how many search hits you're going to get from a million different schools. And you look at some of the schools that say that, and you're going to laugh. Okay? There are schools with budgets that have no business talking about those types of expectations. And yet their AD somehow thinks that they're going to be successful because they can hire the right coach and use the right organizational practices. The reality is that 90% of the teams that are successful because they have a lot of money to use. They have a lot of money to throw at recruiting, nice facilities, at hiring really good coaches. And if you can't compete with that money, well, you're not going to win. And the reality is, if you don't have some kind of unique value proposition or a massive alumni base that can put 100,000 people in the stands for a football game, you're never going to generate enough revenue to compete at that level. And that's just becoming more and more clear by the day.
Great. Jason, we've covered a range of topics here. I'd love to transition towards any final thoughts that you'd have, whether it's about coaching or systems or anything else, and then also if you could leave our guests with a few ways they can follow you or connect with you as well.
Sure. So, and as I mentioned throughout this conversation, I've been fortunate to have a very unique perspective on college sports. I think maybe different than most other people out there, working as an agent representing coaches, working with athletes to help them transition, and then being part of the problem and also being part of the solution of what college athletics is. And I think people really need to understand that just like everything else in this world, everything comes down to money. And if there's not a reasonable solution as to why things need to be done and why some schools have to work really hard to get what they are and then redistribute that money or do certain things from a competitive standpoint, that college sports is not going to change. And we need people that understand that the mission of college sports, first and foremost, was about providing a great student-athlete experience, about maintaining amateurism. And if someone wants to be a professional or they want to make professional money or a school wants to invest into a program, that's fine, but don't do it at the cost of the mission of the actual institution. And if anyone wants to follow my work, they can just Google my name. The first thing that should come up is my column on Forbes. It's called Wicked Jump Shot. You can also follow me on Twitter. It's just at Jason Belzer, my first name, last name.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to get you back here again. We've certainly not shy of topics that we could touch on, and keep up the good work and looking at these things from a much deeper perspective than you ever get on the short talking head shows and the quick pieces that are out there. We really appreciate all the work that you do.
Likewise, I appreciate you guys having me today.
Thank you.